My name is Andrea Bertel, and I'm on Think Tank's Research Officer. I'm happy to be here today with Duncan Green, who's Oxfam Strategic Advisor, also the author of How Change Happens and of the widely known blog From Poverty to Power. He'll be giving the webinar today, Research for Impact. And just as an intro, in case you're not so familiar with on think tanks, I know I've seen that some of you have signed up through our Twitter and social media information. So I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of on think tanks. We are an initiative that studies and supports think tanks. So we provide advice, ideas, courses. We have some more NGO-like activities, so not-for-profit ideas, advice. We run courses on how to set up think tanks. We write a lot of resources that are useful for think tankers, academics, and the wider evidence-informed policy framework. But we also have, and this is where the webinar is situated, is we have a think tank on Think Tank School, when we provide standalone webinars like this one, the Research for Impact. We also have some upcoming interesting ones on writing for policy impact. We have, we just did some on MEL. So do take a look and wander around our website. You'll find other interesting resources. We also have short courses, which are month-long courses. We have a really good one coming up on doing video for policy recommendations. We also have one for writing for policy impact and several other interesting activities. And finally, we run a winter school in Geneva with the Think Tank Hub and Foraus, an organization in Geneva. The applications will be soon coming up. Maybe it's of interest to you. We'll send you some links at the end just for once, along with the video of the webinar, and that will be it. And for now, that's me. I'll give the floor to Duncan Green. As you can see, we have this presentation. You'll see the video of Duncan at the top. We have muted all of your microphones, so in case you want to ask any questions, please do so using the chat function. It's on your, it will appear on your right hand side, and please ask the questions to the group, and Duncan will reply to them when throughout the session. If your question is not being answered, don't worry, we'll get to it by the end of the session, definitely. And again, thank you for coming, and we hope you enjoy this webinar. And now over to you, Duncan.
Great, thanks for that, and thanks on Think Tanks for the invitation. I'm sitting at home in London, which is comfortable, except that the cat is getting close to his feeding time, and he may make an entrance and sort of get in front of the camera, in which case I might have to interrupt this a little bit. I used to be head of research at Oxfam for about 8 years, and I've now got a split job between being a general sort of strategic advisor to Oxfam and working at the London School of Economics. And that's given me a bit of distance from the day-to-day work as a researcher in a large international NGO. And with the rest of the research team in Oxfam, we've been doing some thinking about this very open sort of topic of huge importance to us, which is how do you make sure that all this research you do actually has some kind of impact, changes the world for the better, hopefully. And we're trying to systematize that both through things like this webinar, a chapter we've just written for a book, and we may also be going into the sort of training world. We're talking to a few possible partners around that. So I'll sort of speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes. If you've got a question that you want to put in the middle, chuck it in. I might spot it, but I'm not great at Zoom. So if I miss it, then it will be brought to my attention and I will be interrupted. So that's fine. I'm going to crack on. And if I'm talking too fast, which is always one of my many problems, do say so and in the chat, and then hopefully someone will slow me down. So let's hope. Oh wait, how do I make this? Okay. First technical problem. There we go. Right. This is one of my favourite slides, pictures on evidence into policy. It's from a demonstration in Washington a few years back, and it's a classic kind of geek academic view of how do we bring about change. We show people the evidence, we do it rigorously with peer review, and it brings about change. And my answer to that is, yeah, right. That's really not what happens. And if much of academia is still stuck in this mode, and some NGOs, I think, too, then we have a problem. So the question is, aside from your rigorous peer-reviewed evidence, what else is necessary to actually have impact on policy making? I'm going to talk about 4 things which I think and we think help make sure that research has impact. Understanding the system, and I'll talk a little bit about power analysis and processes of change. The issue of framing and timing, I think, is often underestimated. What else do you need to do apart from research? And then how do you go about making sure the rest happens well? So, hold on a second. Got to, all right, let's move things around a bit. Okay, good. So the first thing is that the research you're doing is dropping into a system with lots of activity already going on, lots of alliances, lots of power flowing to and fro, lots of vested interests. So it's not dropping into a neutral zone where people sit around awaiting new evidence, assess it, and then make decisions. So you've got to understand how that system's working, what the problems are, the causes, and the possible solutions to any problems that you want to work on. And you've got to understand the process of making decisions and who is making those decisions. And that seems absolutely obvious, but it's quite often the case that researchers don't pay nearly enough attention to this. They think that, as that placard said at the beginning, the evidence should speak for itself. It may speak for itself, but then no one's listening if you get these other things wrong. Power analysis is slightly different. It's trying to identify who your allies and enemies might be. Who has the power, the capabilities to achieve change, and what kind of evidence will persuade them? If it's evidence at all, it might be something else. So thinking about the decision makers, the people who are the gatekeepers to those decision makers, and then what role research can play in getting to those people and influencing them. And then the fourth one, which I think is probably one of the biggest gaps in a lot of research plans and programs, is that the system is often closed to research in the sense that people aren't interested in your research. They're very busy, they think they know what works, they're getting on with it. And then there are certain moments when suddenly a window of opportunity opens up and suddenly decision makers are looking around and say, well, help, we just had a crisis, something's not working, I've got a new boss, there's a new language, there's this event coming up. There are events around crises, scandals, and unexpected things which open up the chances for having impact. And the question is, have you designed your research system to spot those critical junctures and to take advantage of the window while it's open? So I'm going to talk about these a bit more now. At least I will, if I can get the slides moving. Oh, there we go. So a little bit on power mapping. This is what the slide you see in front of you is an example we use of how to disentangle or unpack a system of players. On a lot of the issues where we're working, there are lots and lots of different actors involved. And we're trying to get a particular piece of legislation or a particular sort of change in policy through, and we're trying to understand the universe of stakeholders, the universe of players. One way to do this is to put them on a 2x2. On the y-axis, the upright axis, is how much do they agree with your policy proposal? And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, how powerful or how influential are they? And this is an example from the climate change negotiations in the run-up to, I think, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And people like the progressive EU bubble are both powerful and supportive. People who agree with a limit of 2 degrees centigrade or less to global warming, but are less powerful, would be the African Union or the Association of Small Island States over there on the left. The people who are powerful but opposed would be people like the Saudis, the oil producers, and Russia. And then there are some people who are not particularly supportive and not particularly powerful. And so you've got clusters. And when you do this power mapping, you will find clusters of groups. There are the sort of natural allies who are powerful, the natural allies who are weak, the opponents who are powerful, and the opponents who are weak. And the nature of research for influencing each of those groups and the nature of a wider advocacy effort will depend on where they are, which cluster they're in. So I just wanted to go into that a little bit. Let's systematize it, let's sort of stylize it a bit to make it easier. So I'll talk about these 4 groups, okay? The supportive, powerful group, A, that cluster, the ones who are like the European Union in the climate change talks. The supportive opposed, the supportive and weak, I've flipped the axes, sorry about this. The cluster B, so that's people like the Africa group. People who are influential, but not really interested either way, C, and then people who are influential and opposed, the cluster D. And let's talk about the kind of research you do for each of those. Let me just check everybody's happy. Yeah, no comments is good, I think, at this point. So when you're looking at the high influence, high support, these are people who are basically on your side. So when you're working with them in terms of advocacy, you would try and bring together groups of players who are in that high influence, high support cluster, but don't normally talk to each other. So say you get private sector, church leaders and CSOs talking to each other, for example, that kind of thing. And the kind of research you need for that is to just give them more ammunition. So it's filling gaps in the evidence, providing good sort of killer facts, the kind of standard stuff you do, which will get them, which will enable them to be more effective when they're going out and arguing your case. In the case of low influence, high support people, players, so something like the Organisation of Small Island States, the lobby tactics will often be to build confidence, put them in touch with more influential players, build bridges, and the kind of research that can help with that is showing that what you're talking about is not crazy, showing that what you're talking about can work. I remember ages ago in the WTO negotiations, the impact of Ha-Joon Chang's work on the trade talks, just showing that the kind of policies that developing countries instinctively felt they wanted to pursue to protect their small farmers, for example, were exactly the policies that the rich countries had used when they were developing. And so that positive sort of message that history is on your side had a tremendous galvanizing impact in the WTO talks in strengthening the self-confidence of a lot of the developing country negotiators. If people are highly influential but aren't necessarily supporting the issue you want to push, then you've got to think a little bit differently, I think. So in terms of tactics, it's often about the messenger, not the message. You know, the people who are not on your side are going to be influenced maybe by someone they fear or someone they respect. So you've got to think a lot about who's carrying your message in. Researchers are not widely respected. It's a shame to say. In some circles, it's much better to have a private sector leader taking it in, or a faith leader, or even a celebrity. I was just looking at Kanye West's support for the Sustainable Development Goals, which is quite something. So thinking about the messenger, not the message. And the research, this is where you come back to windows of opportunity. So these people who are basically not interested will become interested when something happens to shake things up. So when they suddenly know that their current approach is not working because something has gone horribly wrong, when there's a change of leader with a new language, when they know they're going to have to go to a meeting and say something, have an announceable about the issue you're working on. So being very aware of the rhythm of the context for the decision makers will help you spot good moments to influence these people. Now, if it's Russia and you're working on climate change, it's very unlikely you're going to win them over. You know, maybe you can naively think, yes, we can persuade anyone, our evidence is so good. But actually what's probably more realistic is to try and reduce their influence, to move them from being influential and opposed to being less influential and opposed. And that means attacking their own statements, showing why they're wrong, ridiculing them, looking to isolate and divide the opposition coalitions. So each of these is a combination of wider advocacy tactics and the nature of the research. Everybody okay so far? I want to talk a bit about timing. So the way an issue passes from a vague idea into a piece of legislation, a concrete sort of proposal, shapes the kind of research you do. So about 15 years or so, 15 years ago or so, Oxfam's initial work on climate change was to do a very broad message that climate change had human impacts. And we used to send activists to meetings dressed as polar bears with placards saying "Save the Human." The research that accompanied that was similarly general. So it would be bearing witness, actually showing that people on the ground in increasing numbers of developing countries were experiencing climate change. Very broad, back of an envelope calculations about the kind of money that was needed to pay for that kind of adaptation. So these are broad narratives which are trying to shape public opinion and get onto the political agenda. Once you get into the political agenda and you get into negotiations, the kind of research that is useful changes. So instead of these broad picture things, you think more about specific solutions, specific problems. You'll be doing more detailed power analysis because you're trying to get people to shift in terms of policy or spending. The room for maneuver shrinks as you go down this policy funnel, and you're getting into the very detailed textual negotiation. And then at the end of the policy funnel, it doesn't end then. It should really carry on infinitely, because then you have the whole question of implementation. Are any of the policies being implemented? What is the evidence for that? So I think you need to consider with an issue where you are in terms of the public this policy funnel, and that should shape the nature of the research. I personally think that a lot of NGOs are actually much better at the wide end of the policy funnel, getting these big new issues, onto the public agenda. Once you get down the funnel, it becomes much more crowded. You need much more specialist knowledge. It's much harder to have a significant influence. So I think these are the kind of issues that we need to be thinking about in terms of where do we really add value. As I said, enter debates early, but that's not the only issue on timing. There's a political timetable in most political systems, and the nature of the timetable differs, but we really need to understand it. So in some countries, the key issue is elections and manifestos. So there, getting something into a party manifesto is the key to then having influence when it is in government, and fewer people will be lobbying opposition parties to get things in their manifestos, because lobbyists tend to swarm around the people in power. So you might be better off to try and change the policy of a party while it's in opposition, and then when it wins, or if it wins, then you get a result, rather than joining the herd and trying to influence the party of government. So that political timetable. Other political timetables in a country like Zimbabwe, the key issue is not the manifesto, it's changes of leadership. So then you would be thinking, who are the next generation of leaders? How do we reach them? How do we take advantage when there is a change of leadership? So how do we organize around that? Sometimes it's a scandal. We had some really interesting research on domestic violence in Malawi, which was going nowhere until there was a really horrible media story about a particularly nasty incident. And then suddenly doors opened and we were able to get some legislation on domestic violence into the Malawian parliament. So it's being aware and quickly spotting when those windows open up. And that's quite a challenge for researchers, because researchers tend to get paid to do new research. And that means that they're always on to the next thing. With windows of opportunity, it's often a question not of doing new research, because that takes too long. It's a question of dropping what you're doing, repackaging, or looking back at the research you have on this issue, which has now suddenly become a policy priority, and summarizing what you know and the research you've done in the past, and getting it to the right people. And that is a different set of skills, and sometimes it's hard to find budget for that, but it actually is much more effective often than embarking on yet another new piece of research. Some examples from that, when the big global financial crisis hit in 2008, some brilliant campaigners spotted that this was a chance to dust off a 40-year-old policy proposal called the Tobin tax, with a whole pile of accompanying research, which had been completely ignored prior to 2008. They didn't commission much new research. I commissioned a little bit for Oxfam, but basically they were able to use existing research and use it to back a whole campaign. They changed the name from Tobin tax to Robin Hood tax, and it's still in negotiation 10 years later, but there's a possibility that the European Union will introduce a 10-country financial transactions tax because of that good use of a window of opportunity. Climate change is an issue where we know there will be shocks and horrible things happening. Now, when I watch climate shocks in Britain, they're quite, they're relatively minor compared to some of them. But we regularly have big floods, bigger than they used to be, and I see with despair that actually it looks like the climate campaigners haven't really prepared for those things. You could, if you know there's going to be a flood in the west of England, you can get the coalition together, the scientists, the bishops, the former prime ministers, or whatever you want. You can get the research 90% written, because all that attribution of flooding to climate change. You can be ready to go to hit the media within a day or two of the floods with something which is completely specific and tailored to those floods. Doesn't seem to happen, but it's an obvious way that you can take advantage of those windows. Third point on that, which was raised by some people from the British Foreign Ministry when they gave a talk on research for impact recently, is that when a crisis hits, decision makers, senior civil servants, they're not going to start looking at new pieces of paper from people they've never heard. They're going to pick up the phone to someone they trust and say, what the hell do I do? What can you suggest? Who should I talk to? So what's really crucial is that between crises, during peacetime, you invest in relationships. You go and you have the meetings, you talk to politicians, you establish a relationship of trust so that when the crisis hits, they either phone you or at least they pick up the phone when you call. So there's an enormous amount of networking involved, which is not always researchers' strong suit. It's not always what they like doing, but getting those relationships and that reputation is going to make all the difference in these windows of opportunity. Okay, I'm seeing no questions, so I'm just going to blunder on. For all I know, everybody has dropped off and I'm talking to no one, but that's okay. I'll keep going anyway. Now, you're trying to influence a senior civil servant, or maybe even a government minister, maybe a corporate leader. The worst thing to do is to write the paper and then send it to them, okay? Because they'll feel no ownership, no engagement. The paper may not even be on a topic they're interested in. So it's much better to involve targets, to engage targets before the research is actually published, maybe before it's even done. So for example, I'm glad to see I'm not alone, said someone. That's good. Thank you for that reassurance. Katharina. So for example, you can have a target on the reference group or the advisory group for the research. You can make sure you interview the targets as part of the research. You can ask them to comment on drafts. All of those things will make the target feel more interested and engaged with the research. Now, there's an issue of contamination. You don't want to take funding from the person the organisation you're trying to influence. So there are ethical issues to be thought about there. But in general, it makes much more sense to do it this way than to just approach targets cold. I've talked about relationships, be accessible. So, you may have published your paper 6 months ago. If they ask you to come in 6 months' time, you say yes. You've got to adapt to their timetables. You're not in charge. And then this question of messengers. If you do a piece, so if Oxfam, does a piece of research with a large multinational company, you can be guaranteed that it's going to be a nightmare in terms of management, in terms of the TNC trying to spin the findings if it's about them. But when it comes out, it will get far more traction because it's an unusual suspect. People are interested in a Unilever-Oxfam combination or something like that. So think about, again, that question of who do they fear or respect, and whether those people can be involved in the research in some way. And almost as important is how not to do it, right? So I talk to lots of people at the London School of Economics where I work on this, and I say, look, you really don't have to prove that you're smart, okay? Everybody thinks people from the LSE are smart. They're not always right, but that's what they think. And in fact, they're ready to be intimidated. So there's absolutely counterproductive to start talking about, well, my regression shows a p-value of blah. I mean, all that stuff is completely counterproductive. You don't need to worry. You don't need to be unconfident. Trust that you are respected or you wouldn't be in the room. The NGO equivalent of showing off your knowledge is getting angry and shouting a lot, finger wagging, doing this. You must do this, you must do that. And I think it's often not arrogance that makes people do that, but lack of confidence. They're actually, your voice is all wobbly, your heart's going really fast, and you start just pumping and you just get too much adrenaline. Both of those are really counterproductive. If you can do a calm, considered, thoughtful presentation which actually can see the research through the eyes of the person you're trying to influence, it's far better than the sort of shouty version. And the other thing is how not to write. I would say don't write like most of my colleagues. Here's one example, which we use in our internal training on how to write. We have all this extraordinary jargon, which really does put people off. So, every time you use the word resilience, equity, you can actually go through quite a lot of what I write as well. I've been totally contaminated. And then you run it past someone who's smart but doesn't work in the aid business and say, how much of this do you understand? And the answer, worryingly, sometimes the answer is quite low, not much. So thinking always about the recipient, the person you're targeting. Will they understand this? Will they be interested in this? One of the interesting, it's a different piece about writing, but when I try and sort of do classes on blogging and better blogging, the really interesting thing about blogging, one of them is that you have to be in two places at once. You have to be in your own head as the expert, or at least somebody who knows a bit about something, and you also have to be in the head of the person who isn't the expert. And you have to be able to be in both of those at once, which is really difficult. But unless you do that, you retreat into your own jargon, your own specialist vocabulary, and you can say goodbye to impact. So it's trying to ride those two horses at the same time. Okay, a few specialities from the NGO side, which I think we do quite well. And you can see what they are. I won't do PowerPoint karaoke and read them out. I'll just go through them one by one. Killer facts. So this is a really old one. I was at CAFOD, and Tony Blair was going to Africa. First visit by Tony Blair to Africa. Lucky Africa. And the news, the BBC journalist just said something like, the European Union probably spends more on agriculture than it does on aid. And so we thought, that's really interesting. Went in the next day and got somebody who was much better than me on databases and said, okay, go on the EU database and see if we can find out anything. And this guy, whose name is Matt Griffiths, went on and found that the average support from the European Union to eat per cow was £2 a day. And then we compared that with the average income of people in the world, and it was £1.50 a day for, at that point, half the world's people. You've got there what we call a killer fact, which is that it's a juxtaposition which demonstrates that something is unfair. And this one was extraordinary. So we put it out there. We got phone calls from the government ministers' offices saying, can you stand this fact up? Where on earth did this come from? We had all the sources there ready, and it became one of those viral things which goes around. And, people created websites where they said how much each cow in different countries earned. Turns out that Swiss cows earn $7 a day, even more than European EU cows. And it became a big thing. And it has more impact on policy, despite the fact that it took one afternoon to do, than a year's worth of research on the common agriculture policy. So it's really worth refining, coming up with lots of them, testing them, seeing which ones work. Here's a more familiar, more recent one. This again took a couple of days. A colleague of mine who's now at Oxfam, Mexico, Ricardo Fuentes, found two databases. One, the Credit Suisse global wealth distribution, and the other one, the Forbes list of extremely rich people. He got the number of people who are below the halfway line on their total wealth those 3.5 billion, and then just went down the Forbes list, adding it up till he got to 85. It's now come down a lot since then. But that was just extraordinary. We released it, critical juncture, released it for Davos about 5 years ago. It dominated that Davos meeting. It got inequality onto the Davos agenda. We've updated it ever since, and each year it seems that we can get another round of press comment on inequality based on these kind of numbers. Fantastically effective research. The question is, which research institutions would see this as valid research and which would not? And I think this is a good job for INGOs, a good job for think tanks, and actually the World Bank does a lot of this kind of stuff now as well. It's not just, they haven't left us to run the show, but it's a really effective way of getting influence on policy. League tables. So I have lots of complaints about the SDGs, and I've just been writing a presentation for tomorrow on this. One of my biggest complaints is that they don't do enough on league tables, because league tables are really effective in getting the attention of decision makers. In particular, this is a league table Oxfam did on the big 10 food companies worldwide. The only company that's going to be happy on that table is Unilever, which came out at number 1. The other 9 are going to want to know how they get to number 1, or they're going to make a big effort to try and rubbish the stats. Either way, you get lots of comeback, lots of publicity, lots of potential impact by using a league table. The trouble with the SDGs is that they don't do a league table that is useful, say regional league table showing how much better Bangladesh is than India, which would get huge amount of coverage in the subcontinent, in India and Bangladesh. They're not doing that kind of thing. It's not being driven by actually trying to have impact. So I think league tables are a lot of work. They have to be really rigorous. If you put out a half thought through league table, it gets shot down. That does you lasting reputational damage. So they're big investments. If you get them right, look at the Transparency International league table on corruption. Look at the Doing Business league table from the World Bank. Whatever you think of the methodology and the politics, they have phenomenal influence. So I think always worth thinking, does this issue lend itself to a league table? And it doesn't have to be international. There have been some fascinating league tables, say in Vietnam, comparing the accountability of different municipalities done by a combination of NGOs and mass organizations. So these work anywhere where a decision maker can be shamed by comparison with decision makers in a parallel tier. And this is companies, local government, national government. League tables may well be a good way to go. Executive summaries. So I've got a sort of running competition for the longest Oxfam executive summary, which currently stands at 68 pages. Okay? There was a report, I'm not going to say what it was about, which Oxfam published with a 68-page executive summary. So I phoned up the authors and said, you've got to be kidding. What executive is going to read a 68-page executive summary? What normal person of any kind is going to read 68 pages? And they said, yes, I know, but we were so exhausted and we hated each other by the time we finished the report that no one had the stomach to do a proper executive summary. So we just all chipped in some pages, stuck it together and banged it out. As far as I'm concerned, you might as well just throw the report in the bin and save the printing costs. The only thing that almost any policy target is going to read is a 2-page or less executive summary. So that if you just start from that assumption, then half the effort for the overall effort of the report should go in that executive summary. If you're exhausted by the time you finish the paper or you hate each other, go on holiday, come back and write the executive summary, get a good night's sleep, refresh yourself, read the paper as if it's new, and then think, okay, suppose that these 2 pages are the only thing anyone's going to read. What's the best stuff to put in that? It has to be freestanding. It's no good doing an executive summary which says, in chapter 3 we discussed this, in chapter 4 we discussed this. Completely useless. You've got to have your best bits, your best graphics, your best quotes, your best one-liners, your best killer facts. It's all got to be in that executive summary. If it's a really important report, then it's worth testing. Get 2 I mean, I've never seen this done. I'd be interested if anyone has tried it. But get 2 or 3 people to write competing executive summaries and test them with an audience. See which ones people like most, because it's so important to the success of the paper. The other thing, I forgot, which is there's a saying in journalism: "Dog bites man, not a story." Okay, so Oxfam angry about injustice, not a story. Man bites dog, story. So is there anything in your paper which might surprise people, which people might not expect to come from you? Oxfam says businesses are good. You know, Oxfam says this faith leader is doing great work on women's rights. Anything you can do like that will get people's attention much more than saying what they expect you to say. Social media. Social media is an infinite time suck. I spend far too much of my time putting off doing proper stuff by just looking at my Twitter feed. So I realize that you have to prioritize. But a lot of people do exactly what I do and spend their time doodling about on various platforms. So make sure that what you do is going to come to their attention on those platforms. So every day I look at my RSS feed. I use Feedly. People have different RSS feeds, which is my personal news feed. And it has about 40 or 50 titles. And all you see is the title of a blog by this think tank or that NGO or an article in that newspaper or that magazine. I click on about 6 or 7 of them purely on the basis of the title. So the title has to be interesting. There's somebody at The Guardian who I think must be a saboteur, because The Guardian titles are sometimes things like "The UN issues new report," which is so bad it's almost good. But I wouldn't. That's a high-risk strategy. It's much better to go for clickbait of different kinds. You need to adjust your level of clickbait desperation. So I think lots of references to sex in development titles just looks sad and desperate. But I think listicles, 5 things you need to know about X, seems to work. Putting a particular country in a title is very dangerous. You lose a lot of readers who are not interested in that particular country. So think about whether the topic actually is more generally relevant, and if so, don't put the title of the country in, those sort of things. Twitter is a great medium for sharing research content. There's fantastic stats on some of this stuff. Don't try and tell the whole story. The infographics are getting longer and longer and longer, so they now look more like graphic novels, and you can't read it on your phone. So take one element which is going to be interesting, stick that up. The video must be 60 seconds or less, preferably with subtitles for people who don't want to turn the sound on. So making all your outreach material suitable for social media. All right, I've got a question here from Anna. What should be the periodicity of sharing information on social media? So, okay, I'll tell you what I do. I'm not sure there's a single answer for this. I tweet quite a lot, probably, 10, 15 tweets a day. Most of it not to my stuff. Okay, most of it's to interesting things I've read, so I circulate a lot of stuff. When I've got a blog which gets retweeted by people with comments, I might retweet the comment. I would only send my own introduction to that blog twice, probably. So it varies. Again, on Twitter, I don't think you should be too desperate. You shouldn't just keep retweeting the same thing over and over again. You'll piss people off and you'll lose followers. So you need to be respectful of people's timelines and inboxes and things, I think. What I haven't talked about here, weirdly, it's a bit of an oversight, is blogging, which is kind of what I do. I blog I've got a 5-a-week habit on blogging. So if you want to ask about blogging in the Q&A, that's fine. But otherwise, let's open up. What do you want to talk about? Shall I just take the questions? Is that the right thing to do? Yeah, okay, fine. So Aaron. Interesting examples or case studies of use of social media for research impact. Well, the World Bank has done some pretty impressive research on the use of economics blogs and what the economics blog does for your citations and downloads. And it basically shows a massive improvement in citations and downloads if you blog. one mention on Freakonomics, which is a massive economics blog, is equivalent to 3 years of citations and downloads, right? So if you can get into the sort of the stratosphere of blogging, like Freakonomics, then you're doing really well. So I think it's worth blogging your paper. It's worth trying to bring it to the attention of other people. I'm reluctant to say to send me an email because there's a lot of you, and I'm going to have limits in terms of how much I can look at. But I post quite a few guest posts on From Poverty to Power, and that has a decent readership. So think about it sort of strategically. How to get the general public, especially young people, to engage in policy debates. I'd be interested in other people's comments on that. I think you've got to think about the platform. So increasingly, Twitter is looking like an old person's platform, which is really depressing because I really don't want to go on Instagram. But you need to think, in any given country, the mix might be different. So in some countries, Facebook is still cool. In other countries, Facebook is rapidly becoming uncool. So you need to adapt the platform to the issue, but also the way you talk. I think probably you need to get more young people involved in writing and producing content rather than oldies like me. Because if I intentionally try and write for young people, there's a fair chance it's going to be embarrassing. It's like I always used to humiliate my kids when they lived at home by trying to use their slang in front of their friends, which was just, they just wanted to kill me. So you've got to be careful in terms of how you do that stuff. And I would say get the right people involved. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah, interesting question from Jenny. When is it necessary to use knowledge brokers? So I think there's a couple of, so these are people whose job is to make a bridge between the researcher and the policy target. There's a lot of downsides with knowledge brokers. One is that the policy target often wants to talk to the organ grinder, not the monkey. The policy, the decision maker wants to talk to the originator of the research. So they might not want the comms team to phone them up or the knowledge broker. And also the knowledge broker will only have a more superficial understanding of the content of the research. So they may be fine at pitching the research, and then the person asks them a question, and they have to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll get back to you on that," which is really irritating, and you probably won't ever get to finish that conversation. On the other hand, some researchers are terrible at talking to policymakers, and they just say, "Oh, it's far more complicated than that," or they say everything is context specific. I can't possibly generalize, or various other forms of professional suicide when it comes to trying to influence policy. So in that case, you may well want somebody in between. So then you need a knowledge broker who's as knowledgeable as possible and will do that. The other reason to use knowledge brokers is if you genuinely fear that your work might be contaminated by being too close to a policy target. I think that's exaggerated, but some people find that a very serious risk. How to convince this is from on think tanks, and it's to everyone. Oh, these questions are to everyone. Beg your pardon. I'm intervening. How to convince the wonks inside an organisation to make research more accessible to non-wonks. Any thoughts? Feel free to unmute and come on and say. Yes, money talks. Show them that the funders care. I think it's also important to send feedback. Like if you hear, if you're in a meeting or somewhere where you hear that research is being praised by a non-obvious target, let the researchers know, because they can be quite isolated about this. They may not be aware of it. And they're all increasingly aware of impact now. So in the UK, 20% of your research funding, if you're at a university, from central government is dependent on proof of impact. So suddenly, this is why we're getting a lot of requests for seminars on this. 20% of people's, and it's 20% of a large pot of money is dependent on proof of impact, and a lot of academics are only just really starting. Okay, so this is from Karen Brock. In your executive summary slide, you talked about how important narrative is. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by narrative in that context? So, a bad narrative is our regression shows a significant correlation between X and Y. That will only really speak to other researchers, and maybe not even them. A good narrative is something like a metaphor, you know. We're all on a life raft. Some are bailing more quickly than others, or you know, the Titanic is an endlessly productive metaphor for climate change. So metaphors work, stories work, reference to things that people already know about. So talking about systems, complex systems, for example. I do quite a lot of work on systems thinking and complexity. And it struck me that a lot of the people who are experts on complexity quite like the complexity of it. And they don't actually want to make it simple. They actually want to come across as really smart. I think maybe some of them were bullied at school and they just want to get their own back. So they keep it really difficult. And actually, if you say, look, a complex system is like your own life, you didn't know when you were at the age of 15, you had no idea how your life was going to pan out, or a complex system is like raising a child. You cannot predict what's going to work when you raise a child. You learn by doing, you learn by failing, you have feedback loops, and you co-produce with the child, and you come to some kind of good enough. That's a great metaphor for a lot of what organizations try and do. So using those stories and metaphors really gets the message across much better than a dry scientific approach. It does partly depend on the audience. Well, to a large extent, it depends on the audience. So if you're talking to a wonk in a government department, they're quite happy with your regression. That's fine. If you're talking to a politician, it's quite likely that A, they're going to want to know, what do I do? So they're going to want to have some specific proposals. But they may also want to see somebody or something, and that will stick in their mind. And that'll be far more effective than a paper. So rather than research at all, or maybe in accompanying research, you take them to see something. So it's thinking about what's going to stick in someone's head. And there's various kinds of narrative, if you want to call it. Alex Evans has written a wonderful book called The Myth Gap, saying that with activism generally, but especially on climate change, is not drawing on the body of myths which are generalized and come basically from faith organizations. You know, the myth of the flood, the sort of 7 or how many it is basic storylines in for fiction. That there are these sort of underlying myths which people immediately relate to. Look how good Hollywood is. You can watch a Hollywood film and think, okay, there's only about 6 plots in a Hollywood film, and every time I cry anyway because they're so effective. So if we can get as good as Hollywood in terms of telling narratives which resonate with people, that will make a huge difference. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer. Thanks, Karen. Excellent. Research impact in an autocratic environment. Okay, so one of the kind of alarming things I realized at one point when I was running the research team is that there are autocracies which are more evidence-based than democracies, okay? If you want to influence the Vietnamese government, the best way to do it is to commission some research from the Vietnamese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a parastatal research body which the Vietnamese government and the Communist Party trust. You do some research with VAS, you co-publish it, or just let VAS publish it, and you know that the government and the party will take it seriously. Ditto the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Russia, even in Russia, if you're not doing system-threatening research, evidence can work really well. So we did a piece of research ages ago on disability benefits, which showed that the system in Russia was bizarre and ineffective. In Russia at that point, if you were disabled, to get your benefits, you had to reapply every year and prove that you were still disabled. So you had people who had lost a limb in Afghanistan required to prove every year that the limb had not magically grown back. And that could take up to 6 months because of all the bureaucracy involved and the tests and the checks and all the rest of it. Once we had done the research and demonstrated that, the officials said, yeah, that's ridiculous, we'll change it. And it didn't require a big campaign, a big people on the streets thing, because we were below the threshold, we were able to influence. So I think the other stuff that's worked well in Vietnam is the thing I told you, the league table between 68 municipal governments. The way they did that was that they partnered with an official Communist Party mass organisation. So they had a bit of political cover. Even so, when they first published the league table, they were getting death threats from some of the municipal governments who came out badly. But the second year they did it, they were getting phone calls saying, how do you help us move up the table? How do you help us improve accountability? So you need to think a lot about the politics and the risk and how you cover yourself, but it's absolutely possible as far as I can see. Any more? This is a very good question. What institutional structures and incentives help or hinder the impact of research? So I think one of the structures, I'm not sure if it's a structure or an incentive, is that you achieve research prominence by finding out something new, right? A piece of research which says, yeah, we just proved that what we thought was true is true, does not make headlines, does not get you published. It's not good news. You get impact by trashing someone else's work and by proposing or coming up with something new. That means that you're always trying to be ahead. You're always trying to think about your own research, and that makes you blind to these windows of opportunity. So I think that's one. And in a way, maybe that's another argument for knowledge brokers, because knowledge brokers maybe are more driven by the opportunity of impact rather than career advancement. Another incentive is that the incentive in academia is to talk a different language. I love the Institute of Development Studies to bits. I think they do great work. Their politics is great. Their language is often impenetrable. It's very postmodern. Everything's contested, and it's not a language that any normal person speaks. So I think that does damage your ability to communicate. I think funding for research tends to be actually a bit better. Probably, if anything, funding for research tends to be longer term than funding for the other parts of, say, the aid and development sector. So maybe the length of the funding is not such a problem. One of the enduring issues in academic research is that for 20 years, funders have been saying we want more voices from developing countries in these research programs. And for 20 years, organizations like the LSE have been struggling with that. And I think it's partly the language issue, it's partly the network issue, the old boys network, the peer review. There's lots of things in academia which conspire and combine to prevent us moving to a situation where there's a more democratic approach to generating ideas and knowledge between different countries and different groups of people. I'd be interested in whether people have got good examples. I'm a big fan of IDRC in Canada, who've slogged away at this with some success for decades. But I'd be interested on Think Tanks itself is based in Lima, whether they think the tide is shifting on that one. Jenny saying, you mentioned at the beginning you're considering some training on this topic. What would this look like? Who would it target? Well, that's what we're talking about. But I mean, my idea would be to have a summer school or a winter school or something where you get 20 people together who are doing this stuff, who are researchers for progressive institutions of one sort or another. They each come with a project proposal or a piece of work underway, and that's part of the material for say a week or 2 weeks. You unpack this kind of stuff. You have lots of case studies, lots of writing exercises, blog training, all the rest of it, and then people have to work on their impact plan for a piece of research, and then they redesign the research to improve the impact plan. They comment on each other's, and you just get that kind of head of steam going. And I'd be very interested in doing that. I'm open to offers at the moment. We're just thinking about it in Oxfam. I don't know if any people have been paying attention, but Oxfam's not had a very good year. I won't go into detail, but let's just say that at the moment we're looking to generate at least cover the costs of some work like this in terms of doing summer schools and paid for and pay-to-play courses of one kind or another. So that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about. Any further literature sources on policy impact? I recommend ODI, Rapid. I recommend on think tanks. I mean, on think tanks, please put forward some suggestions for the best things to read. If you're worried about the politics of all this, there's a very good book by a colleague of mine, Irene Kout, and a number of other writers called The Politics of Evidence. I'll let people know on my blog when the book we've contributed a chapter to comes out. It's a small academic publisher, so it probably won't be for ages, but I'll definitely publicize it when it comes out. Other suggestions, please. I think a resource list with videos would be great. I'm not sure about, if you mean by the webinar video, me staring at the wrong bit of my screen, well, maybe, but I definitely think a resource list would be good. No problem, Aaron. I'm happy to mention Rapid. We done? I think so.
Hi.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Do you want to come in on think tanks and wrap up?
Just briefly, if you want, we'll be sending. Thank you for all of your questions. I've been monitoring the questions you did on the sign-up form, and I noticed that there were also a lot of questions on how to track change and how to track the impact of research into policy. We have some courses on that, and we have some resources on that. We'll follow up with all of you with the webinar slides and a list of recommended readings in case you're interested. And I think that's it. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Duncan. This was excellent for me, and thank you all for asking those very interesting questions. I don't know if you want to say anything more.
Excellent. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Bye, thank you all.